Hi all, quick reminder that if you want early ad-free episodes of Crimes of the Centuries, you can subscribe to Grab Bag Collab on Patreon. Grab Bag Collab is an egalitarian profit-sharing podcasting network I founded with Tony Award-winning actor and podcaster Daisy Egan and with Amanda Rossman, my longtime collaborator on all things journalism. If you subscribe to Grab Bag Collab at the Feelin' Extra tier, you'll not only get this show, but you'll have access to several other shows that are only available on that platform. They're not all crime-related. We're called Grab Bag for a reason, and that's because we produce all kinds of shows. Right now, we have an advice podcast about secrets called Dear Daisy, a gossip-laden game show hosted by Rebecca Lavoie called Other People's Problems, a Love is Blind recap show called Shut the F Up, Nick Lachey with Daisy and Broadway superstar Ellen Marsh, and more is on the way. Again, go to patreon.com/grabbagcollab and see what we've got going over there. And in case you're curious, here's our tagline: no assholes allowed. Some crimes are so heartbreaking or shocking that they change laws, change society, or even earn the label Crime of the Century. But the stories that made headlines in decades past aren't necessarily remembered today. I'm Amber Hunt, a journalist and author, and in each episode of this show, I'll examine a case that's maybe lesser known today, but was huge when it happened. This is Crimes of the Centuries. Used to be, Halloween was a pretty tame affair when it came to kids in neighborhoods anyway. Children threw on sheets and pretended to be ghosts, and moms handed out homemade treats: apples, pencils, pennies, maybe a handful of those gross orange marshmallow blobs called circus peanuts, some candy corn, and the licorice the kids hauled home last Halloween that no one wants to eat. Then they'd call it a night. Now I have an older girlfriend who remembers that the women in the neighborhood where she grew up in Texas would spice things up a bit with the treats. They'd give you homemade fudge, popcorn balls, candied apples, and pralines if you came by on Halloween, but only if they knew you. The rest of the begging kids got less exciting booty. Now, Halloween candy historians, yes, that's a real job, tell me that junior-sized versions of Baby Ruth and Butterfinger showed up during the Depression because that's all people could afford. But only a certain number of folks could manage even that kind of indulgence. During World War II, when sugar was in short supply, the pencil and penny enthusiasts got reinvigorated, and Halloween was saved. Kind of. Some renewed vigor was injected into the holiday during the 1960s, which saw a lot of full-time homemakers trying to be Betty Crocker. Halloween got a fresh boost with baggies full of homemade cookies. Now bear with me here, this little history lesson's importance to our story will make sense soon. In 1961, Mars, the folks who created M&M's, Milky Way, Three Musketeers, and Twix, got in on the little one-bite candy bar party. They called their downsized versions Fun Size, which as an aside caused a legal ruckus about whether you can trademark fun. All of this, again, is a long way around the block to explain that candy and Halloween used to be a free-form kind of catch-all. But that changed for good in 1974 when a little 8-year-old boy named Timothy O'Brien was told he could have just one treat from his Halloween haul before bed. He chose the tall Pixy Stix tube that, he knew, was filled with flavored sugar crystals that would tingle his tongue. He tipped his head back, couldn't quite get the candy loose from the straw, asked his father for help, and, after a little futzing, tried again. Then the boy told his father that the candy tasted funny. They tried a little Kool-Aid to wash it down. The boy then swallowed enough cyanide to kill 2 adults. It could have been any kid. It could have been a whole neighborhood of them. It could be a nationwide plot. This was monstrous, panic-inducing, demonic, and it was, except that it really couldn't have been any kid. It had to have been one of 5 kids in Timothy's suburban Houston neighborhood. More specific than that, it was supposed to be 2 specific children in that neighborhood whose lives had recently been insured by their father. The local NBC affiliate Susan Starnes reported on the later trial of that man.
Ronald Clark O'Brien was notorious for 2 reasons. He killed his own son, and he ruined the tradition of Halloween trick-or-treating.
And 40 years later, the point was made again by the affiliate's investigative reporter, Robert Arnold.
He's definitely one of the reasons that kids everywhere have to check their candy, and whether you realize it or not, you've heard about this guy in some form or fashion.
And yeah, just like that, Halloween, as everyone knew it, changed. Everything handed out on Hallows Eve from then on had to be inspected by good parents who sifted out the suspect bites from the unquestionably untampered with. It also put a dent in Pixy Stix sales, at least temporarily. Local police departments started elementary school programs that taught food safety. These were almost always scheduled in late October. One of the lawyers representing Timothy's father, in opening remarks to the court hearing the appeal of his conviction, famously remarked, quote, "As you know, my client was convicted of killing Halloween," end quote. But it went further than that. Today, risk-averse moms and dads and litigation-averse school systems follow strict protocols that outlaw homemade birthday cupcakes and mandate instead such fare as individually wrapped Twinkies. But Halloween suffered the most. Something sweet and magical had turned wicked, all because a doughy optician named Ronald Clark O'Brien needed some cash. Let's start with this plain and simple fact. Ronald Clark O'Brien was not a smart man. His plan to kill children was neither complicated nor well conceived. He was an optician, which is not the same as an optometrist. O'Brien's job was to fit glasses at Texas State Optical, a chain eyeglass store. He was relatively new at it, having already been in the insurance business and, before that, working for a chemical company. If you see a theme at work here, you're not alone. Anyway, he was also not a particularly great employee, having worked 21 different jobs in 5 different cities in a single decade of work. He was asked to depart some of those places of employ on account of his negligence or fraud. As an optician, he netted $150 a week. Not terrible money back then, about $47,000 a year in today's money. Still, the house that the 4-person family had previously lived in had been foreclosed upon, so O'Brien moved them into a rented townhouse in the suburban working-class village of Deer Park, a town located on the Houston Ship Channel and surrounded by oil refineries. By October 1974, his salary was, according to the record of his later appeal, quote, virtually consumed by rent, car payments, and grocery expenses. Still, appellant owed GAC, that's his auto lender, about $2,000 in a delinquent loan and another $800 to the government, end quote. I'm going to assume that was the IRS. Being 8 months behind on his $149 per month car payment also meant he had received a letter threatening repossession. Later, it was figured he was something like $100,000 in debt. That's about $600,000 today. He had recently applied for a nearly $2,000 loan and was denied. At the beginning of 1974, however, he found time and money to acquire life insurance policies on his 2 small children. Each policy was in the amount of $10,000. Premiums weren't much, but his wife thought it was an expense they could ill afford. She apparently said so. She also voiced her opinion that life insurance on the children was just not necessary. They were not wage earners, they were children. Meanwhile, O'Brien, a good Baptist, spent his free time singing in the church choir and also running the church's school bus program. His pastor would try to reassure a jury later that O'Brien was, quote, a good Christian man and an above-average father, end quote. When August came around, though, this above-average father was looking for a way to cash in by killing his 5-year-old daughter and his 8-year-old son. Of course, no one knew that, but some did sense that something was off. O'Brien was now under scrutiny by his current employer, who suspected he'd been taking money from the till. Whatever padding that was providing O'Brien couldn't have been enough to assuage his money woes, and yet he managed to scrounge to buy even more life insurance. This was in late September or early October. To be clear,
having life insurance on your children was just as unusual in 1974 as it is today, especially for an amount that far exceeds the cost of a funeral.
This was from a documentary by Biographics. To double check, I looked up stats. According to Insurance Hub, less than 20% of parents have bought life insurance for their families, period, as in spouses too. So yeah, it isn't typical for parents to have insurance policies on kids, period. That's not to say there aren't good, non-nefarious reasons to have such policies, but it is unusual. Anyway, when O'Brien returned to his life insurance agent to buy even more, the agent said he didn't think it was prudent. Still, O'Brien bought $20,000 more per child, adding a small aside to his agent. Don't tell my wife. The master criminal had little insurance on himself and his wife. On this occasion, however, he took the opportunity to decrease it. He had also started to set his plan into action. 2 months earlier, O'Brien, to expedite the payout, remembered that the optical profession had once used cyanide to clean gold frames for glasses. He asked the manager of his office to order some. The manager knew that cyanide had gone out of favor in his industry some 20 years earlier, so he let the request slide. But O'Brien didn't. A few weeks later, he asked his manager to move the request up the chain. He also openly talked about the benefits of cyanide with his coworkers who, on slow days I guess, talked as well about how much of the stuff it might take to end someone's life. Getting antsy that his employer was not going to aid him in this enterprise, O'Brien decided to try another route. He called a friend with whom he used to work at Arco Chemical Company. Cooking up a story that he was taking a chemistry course at the local junior college, O'Brien started in on how the teacher wasn't up on his cyanide facts. He said the guy showed no knowledge of the chemical's different varieties and their uses. This apparently got the two old friends into a discussion about cyanide, which eventually led O'Brien to ask where a person might acquire it and how much it might take to actually kill someone. He also asked exactly how it worked. Creepy. Now let's pause a minute here to talk about what actually does happen when someone ingests potassium cyanide. It's been a while since we've waded through this, and it's important to remember that cyanide goes far beyond the bitter almond odor that's usually described on Forensic Files episodes. From the infographics show.
Cyanide can be incredibly deadly at very small doses. This is why it's been used throughout history as a poison in warfare, genocide, and murder. Cyanide disrupts your mitochondrial powerhouses and causes you to die from lack of energy. At a basic level, your mitochondria takes sugar from the food you eat and the oxygen from the air you breathe and reassembles them into energy, carbon dioxide, and water. This is called cellular respiration. The most important part of the process is the production of energy. Without it, you literally cannot survive.
When cyanide is in one's system, a person may vomit, spasm, and mercifully fall unconscious, though death will take 10 or 15 minutes, sometimes even longer. Once swallowed, the cyanide mixes with the water in the mouth and in the body and becomes something nasty called hydrocyanic acid. Convulsions rack the body, and moving down the alimentary tract to the stomach, the acid enters the bloodstream and rapidly interferes with the body's ability to use oxygen. The heart dilates, veins engorge. The brain begins a rapid death. There is a better than 95% chance of death, even if you get the right kind of treatment immediately. say if you worked for a chemical company who had supplies for such accidents on hand. During O'Brien's trial, it became clear that when he called his friend to talk cyanide, he led the conversation into the directions that he wanted his chatty partner to engage in, though later the friend would testify that even back then, he found the conversations strange. The friend would confirm that he had given O'Brien referrals for supplies for his chemistry courses, remember? The friend, of course, had no idea that O'Brien wasn't enrolled in any such classes at any local junior colleges or universities. Either way, the old friend referred O'Brien to a few local outlets, including chemical supplier Curtin Matheson Scientific. Just before Halloween, O'Brien headed out to the Houston-based chemical distributor and talked to a salesman named David Lee Jackson. Later trial testimony showed that the two men discussed the purchase of cyanide, with Jackson explaining that the smallest amount he could sell O'Brien was a 5-pound sack. "That's too much," said O'Brien, asking where he could get less. The men discussed some alternate sources, and O'Brien left without any product, finding it instead someplace where a smaller amount could be had. That would be less suspicious and also cheaper. Sometime that fall, O'Brien also started chatting with a friend he had met at church, a married guy named Jimmy Bates with 2 children of his own, about buying a house together as an investment property. The two men got so far as to talk what price range the home could be in and where they might start looking. By the way, O'Brien told Bates he didn't want his wife to know about the real estate plan. Then, 2 weeks before Halloween, O'Brien bought Halloween costumes for his kids, told his wife that he would take them trick-or-treating this year, despite the fact that he had never done so, and arranged to have his buddy Jimmy Bates bring his 2 children along so they could all trick-or-treat together. Bates liked the plan and invited the whole O'Brien family to join his family for dinner that night. "It'll be fun," he said. A week before Halloween, O'Brien went to his credit union and, explaining that he would be coming into some money before the end of the year, convinced his loan officer to rework the payment schedule for the amount he owed, making it due on January 1st, 1975, instead of immediately. On the afternoon of Halloween, one of O'Brien's customers saw him in the optical store's parking lot carrying a bag full of something and a stapler. Later, when O'Brien worked with the same customer, the two talked about cyanide and how much of it constituted a lethal dose. It was almost as if O'Brien were playing a game called "How Many People Can I Find Who Will Testify in Vivid Detail Against Me in Court?" Apparently unaware of the trail of very large crumbs he'd been leaving for investigators, Ronald Clark O'Brien's Halloween plot was picking up steam. So much so that he even told a coworker that he was going to quit his job in a few weeks. Another life change that he failed to discuss with his wife. Finally, Halloween night arrived. O'Brien's kids, excited because, well, they're 8 and 5 and it's Halloween, got dressed for the big event. From a 1975 newscast.
Bates said that before Halloween, O'Brien asked if he could bring his children over to trick-or-treat with the Bates children on Halloween night. Both families ate dinner together, and then the fathers took the children trick-or-treating.
Actually, not all 4 children went. One of Bates's kids didn't like that the weather had turned rainy, so she bailed, but the other 3 children headed out with their dads into the less-than-perfect night. While walking, O'Brien suggested a seemingly ad hoc strategy. He would accompany the kids to the doors, and Daddy Bates would wait on the sidewalk. Because the rain persisted, the number of streets visited by the group that night was limited to just 2. They even skipped some homes for various reasons, though O'Brien insisted they go up to a darkened house at 4112 Donerail, the home of Courtney and Carolyn Melvin, where, after the usual sweet taunt of trick-or-treat, no one appeared. The kids ran on to the next house, but O'Brien remained behind for what later would be reported to be about 30 seconds. Bates didn't see the porch light turn on or see anyone answer the door. Yet, suddenly invigorated, O'Brien bounded toward the foursome and told them that the door had, in fact, opened, and that the quote-unquote rich neighbors who had answered the door handed him these giant 18-inch long Pixy Stix for the kids, including a few for the kiddo who had opted against the trek. The kids were thrilled. They added the sticky, sickly, sweet powdered candy to their little stash of goodies. Oddly, the sticks were taken back at one point by O'Brien, who took them to his house, returning to the Bates home shortly thereafter to redistribute them to the kids. Later at the Bates' residence, a different kid showed up at the door, spotted O'Brien, and said, "Hey, I know you from church." O'Brien handed the boy a leftover giant Pixy Stix. O'Brien's wife, who had stayed behind at the Bates' during the trick-or-treating, decided to stop by another friend's house when the family was returning to their own home. O'Brien said he would get the kids ready for bed. At bedtime, O'Brien told his children they could each have one thing from their haul. Timothy, age 8, chose the Pixy Stix. The little boy got the package opened and took a gulp, but he had trouble getting the product to flow into his mouth, so O'Brien rolled the candy between his hands to loosen up the granules for his son. Timothy tried again, then complained to his dad that it didn't taste good. O'Brien had just the trick. He'd get the boy some Kool-Aid and have him use that to wash the bad taste out of his mouth. Timothy drank the Kool-Aid. As an aside, there are notes in the later trial's appellate record that indicate there actually, quote, is some evidence that appellant poured the candy into Timothy's mouth, end quote. That would have been before the Kool-Aid chaser. In any case, the boy soon vomited repeatedly and went into convulsions. O'Brien called an ambulance. Timothy died shortly after his father reported that he, quote, went limp in my arms, end quote. When they arrived at the hospital, O'Brien went into all the appropriate stages of grief. From an episode of the docuseries The Evidence Room by click2houston.com.
So at the hospital, O'Brien's like, he's beating his hands against the wall. Oh my God, please God, don't take my son. No, not my son, everything.
He flung himself across little Timmy. He cried, he wailed. He went so far as to tell all who would listen that he too had vomited and felt ill.
The doctors actually got worried that he may have been poisoned too. And so they lay him down on the gurney and like, okay, we may need to pump your stomach. And almost instantly, it was like a light switch. He went, no, I'm good, thanks. And hops up off of the gurney.
Many of those in the hospital that night would remember the miraculous rebound the father made. But grief is an odd thing, and death requires so much of loved ones. There's just so much to do. But first things first. At 9 a.m. the very next morning, as offices opened, Ronald Clark O'Brien, whose son had died barely more than 12 hours earlier, called his insurance company, asking how to collect on his son's death. A half hour later, he called on his bank to ask them how to collect on an insurance policy that he'd taken out on his children as part of a savings club. Meanwhile, in the boy's stomach, the coroner found 16 milligrams of cyanide. A blood test found 0.4 milligrams of cyanide in his blood. A fatal human dose for an adult is between 0.2 and 0.3 milligrams. The source was clearly the Pixy Stix. The police did not wait to be invited to do all but an anal probe of Daddy O'Brien. After the death of Timothy O'Brien, one of the first stops investigators made was to the Bates home, where one of the children was found asleep with a giant Pixy Stix in his hand, unopened. Some theories suggest that little Mark Bates, the boy in question, had been thwarted by the staple closing the packet, but the boy's father said otherwise in 1975. Jimmy Bates told reporter Jackie Gore that his wife had saved their boy with her fastidiousness. Because the rain had been so heavy that Halloween night, Jean Bates had ordered Mark straight into the bath when he got inside and then denied his request to eat the Pixy Stix because she deemed it messy, outside candy. Whatever serendipity intervened that night, it, of course, did nothing to calm the fears spreading through that chunk of Houston. The news from every average parent's perspective was straightforward. A child had died from tainted candy, and so everyone promptly turned in their children's Halloween sacks to police. Police found 4 remaining poisoned sticks. Each showed that 4 inches of candy had been removed and replaced with cyanide. Each contained twice as much as was remaining in Timothy's plastic straw, suggesting that Timothy's fatal dose had been just half the amount he could have ingested. At trial, the makers of Pixy Stix explained that staples are not how the candy is secured in its holder. The ends are sealed with heat and fused securely for safety reasons. They confirmed that the company had never used staples for that purpose, but all of the recovered poisoned pixies were stapled shut. What do you know? A staple, a knife, and scissors were found in O'Brien's home. Now, we all have such things in our houses, so that on its own wouldn't have been very damning. But each of the ones in O'Brien's possession had purple plastic residue similar to the Pixy Stix packaging, and there was evidence of crystalline sugar adhering to the tools. Later, of course, our criminal genius was found to have talked to various co-workers about this great new pocket stapler he'd picked up and how useful it was. Next, the police asked O'Brien where he thought he picked up the candy. With the news media and a crowd of neighbors trailing behind, O'Brien wandered around the neighborhood pointing out a few spots, which all came up implausible, until he landed upon the 4112 Donerail address. O'Brien would later tell jurors that he was, quote-unquote, almost positive that the man of the house, one with a hairy arm, was the one who gave him the tainted treat. This is Houston reporter Robert Arnold talking fairly recently to Vic Driscoll, one of the prosecutors on O'Brien's case, as the two revisited O'Brien's story.
O'Brien walked up to the door, and he said, knocked on the door, and someone inside kind of opened, whom he didn't see, opened the door and stuck out his hand with a handful of Pixy Stix.
I was one of those reporters who followed along the crowd of people through the streets in Pasadena as Ronald Clark O'Brien was pointing out where he thought his child got that Pixy Stick.
And he took those and back. Nobody, and this is...
So this no-faced person in a dark house
Right.
that other people had knocked on suddenly opens the door for O'Brien and just hands a bunch of Pixy Stix to him.
Right.
In case you're curious, why yes, the whole don't take candy from strangers thing had predated this case by a century, literally. That warning became ubiquitous after the kidnapping case of 4-year-old Charlie Ross, who'd been seduced from his front yard by a stranger offering candy. So this faceless, candy-giving, hairy arm should have been a red flag for Ronald O'Brien, if the story had been true. Now, the man who lived in that Donerail house was Courtney Melvin, who worked as an air traffic controller at Houston's Hobby Airport. Records showed, and dozens of eyewitnesses substantiated, that he left for work at 1:30 that afternoon and didn't return until 10:45 that night. His wife said she and their kids handed out treats until they ran out, which was around 6:45. After that, they doffed the lights and didn't answer the door. Police had already surveyed the entire neighborhood and found that no one, especially along the route that the Bates and O'Brien families took, gave out giant Pixy Stix to tricksters. Then police began to find all those folks O'Brien talked to in the previous months about cyanide, fatal doses, insurance, and future plans for imaginary money. Meanwhile, O'Brien's wife, Daineen, was bereft. She had adored both of her kids, of course, but Timothy was at that special age when his personality was starting to shine, and she was enjoying getting to know him as a person. Said Jimmy Bates of Daineen, quote, "She really loved that little boy. It was rare to see one without the other. She told us she had shed an ocean full of tears since this happened," end quote. Her husband, on the other hand, had been, per witnesses, excited by the nationwide news coverage of his child's death. The immediate headlines seemed to put blame squarely on the candy. Read one in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch on November 1st, "Dies after eating Halloween candy." Read another from Waco, Texas, "Candy, possible cause of death." The story even made front pages far outside of Texas, like one in the News and Record of Greensboro, North Carolina, which ran a photo of Timothy smiling in a checked shirt above the headline, "Trick-or-treater dies of poisoning." O'Brien was even quoted in some of the Wire stories. He described his son as, quote, "all boy. He loved football, basketball, anything. He never met a stranger, but I have my peace in knowing Tim is in heaven now," end quote. As for the night Timothy died, O'Brien said he gave his boy his Halloween treat and then, quote, "It seems like it wasn't long before he was up and complaining his stomach hurt and he didn't feel good. He was bent over vomiting and I was holding him when he just went limp. It's so disheartening to think there wasn't more we could do. We thought we were so careful. We had even wondered if we should go out trick-or-treating this year. There isn't going to be any more trick-or-treating for us," end quote. In public, O'Brien seemed distraught. Harold Nassif, an investigator on the case.
He gave a eulogy in church that Sunday night that had the whole congregation crying.
But his demeanor outside of the public eye was quite different. His close friends and family noticed that he had begun talking about how to spend that life insurance payout. He suggested maybe taking a vacation with the money. He didn't have long to daydream, though. Before week's end, law enforcement had zeroed in on where and when O'Brien had bought the cyanide and the insurance that was purchased soon before Halloween. The unraveling was nearly complete. When police asked O'Brien's wife, Daineen, about the insurance policies, she only knew about the first ones. She said they were likely worth about $10,000, that would cover the funeral expenses and not much else. She did tell them of all the couple's debts. Those she knew a lot about. Vic Driscoll, the Harris County Assistant DA, remembered telling Mrs. O'Brien what the police had found. She then said to him,
"I had hoped that they would find the real person and I wouldn't have to be thinking that it was him. But I see now that that's not the case."
Less than a week after that harrowing Halloween, on November 5th, 1974, O'Brien was arrested for the murder of his son and the attempted murder of 4 other children, all under age 10. The headlines then were quite a bit different than they had been a few days earlier. "Dad held in poisoning." More people the police knew nothing about, various customers, friends, church members, who had been in discussions of one kind or another with O'Brien, suddenly remembered how he had probed them about their knowledge of cyanide. They did not hesitate to tell law enforcement what they knew. O'Brien's trial, which began on May 5th, 1975, was a major media event. O'Brien offered up 9 people in his defense who said they didn't think he was likely to do this again and, in their opinion, wasn't a danger to society. On June 3rd, it took a jury only 46 minutes to find him guilty of murder. They also sentenced him to die. Once incarcerated, his fellow inmates dubbed him the Candyman. The media, of course, took notice. In an odd twist, by the way, this wasn't Texas's only Candyman. It had earlier been the moniker given a Texas serial killer and rapist named Dean Corll, who was shot and killed by one of his accomplices in a Houston neighborhood not so far from Deer Park. He's suspected of having tortured, murdered, and assaulted at least 42 men who vanished from that area between 1970 and 1973. His nickname came from the fact that he had managed candy shops in Houston and was considered by many to be a quiet man who loved kids. But back to O'Brien and his love for children. A few years after the conviction, the local NBC affiliate had an opportunity to talk with one of the boys, he wasn't named in deference to the privacy of minors, to whom O'Brien had handed a Pixy Stix. This was a child whose death, had it happened, would have given O'Brien plausible deniability for the death of his own insured children.
I wanted to eat it real bad because I was real proud of it. I thought it was the biggest piece of candy I had, and I thought, man, this is great. And I was fixing to open it up and eat it. My mother said, no, don't eat it tonight. Just wait till tomorrow. I just clean the house, the floor's clean. Just wait till tomorrow and eat it outside. And I said, okay, so I put it up.
Now, the only part of his crime that O'Brien had calculated correctly was that he had truly chosen irresistible bait. In hindsight, it seems likely that child speaking was Mark Bates, whose family, by the way, never trick-or-treated again. O'Brien, interviewed while in prison and with his execution date nearing, told a reporter he was innocent of all he had been charged with.
Because I have no guilt, and because I know inside that I didn't do it, and the people that are close to me and know me as an individual know I couldn't have done it, and I know that the Lord knows I didn't do it. So I've really got nothing to be scared about or afraid about.
He was executed, per the law, by lethal injection at midnight on March 31st, 1984. As a reporter from KPRC Houston reported that night,
Ronald Clark O'Brien's execution was cheered the moment spectators caught sight of eyewitnesses coming out of the death house. O'Brien never admitted killing his son, but in a last statement asked and offered forgiveness.
I would forgive all who have taken part in any way in my death. Also to anyone I have offended in any way.
His wife, when asked how she felt in that moment, said, quote, nothing, end quote. Driscoll, the aforementioned prosecutor in the case, said, quote, O'Brien did not have the truth in him even when the truth would do him better. He has used his friends, his family, and his church. He sacrificed his only son, not on the altar of God as Abraham might have done, but on the altar of his own greed, end quote. The executed 39-year-old donated his corneas to science. He was buried in a Pasadena, Texas cemetery. It was not the same cemetery where his son had been laid to rest 10 years earlier. The O'Brien story is regularly brought up at Halloween. Among those often quoted is Mike Hinton, a private Houston attorney who was one of the assistant Harris County prosecutors assigned to the case. He told the Austin American-Statesman in 2016 that, quote, I never get tired of talking about that sorry-ass son of a bitch, end quote. He recalled that once, during a lull in court in that trial, O'Brien leaned over and offered him a Tootsie Roll. Tom Campbell was a local news reporter at the time. He said he never celebrates Halloween, turning his porch light off and eschewing parties. From ABC 13 Houston.
Parents across the country vowed to never celebrate Halloween again. Halloween's never going to be the same.
Never will be the same. Not like it was before this happened.
To this day, despite much continued discussion about the holiday's potential terrors, there are no confirmed cases of children having been poisoned at random by Halloween candy. To prepare for this podcast, journalist Amy Wilson and I read multiple newspaper accounts of the crime and trial. Amy also read O'Brien versus State, the 1979 Texas Court of Criminals Appeals ruling, and the propriety of his death sentence. She also used interviews from The Evidence Room, a news production of KPRC TV Houston. She consulted the National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Disease Control, and Johns Hopkins Center for Public Health for information on how cyanide causes death. Crimes of the Centuries is available early and ad-free through Grab Bag Collab. Join us at patreon.com/grabbagcollab to hear not just exclusive content related to this show, but to also get access to several other shows on our profit-sharing network. Unless noted in the citations, this case was researched and written by me, Amber Hunt, and produced by Amanda Rossman and Henry Lavoie. Original music is by Bruce Hunt, Andrew Higley, and occasionally by my son, Hunt Van Benscoten. Other music comes from Soundstripe and Epidemic Sound. If you like the show, help us out by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts. For more information or to recommend a case, go to centuriespod.com. On Instagram, we're at centuriespod, and check out our Crimes of the Centuries podcast Facebook page. By the way, my kid's insured because I'm paranoid as shit, but I don't even know why, because my work offers it and I clicked OK. Oh God, this is going to end up in okay.